we are what the future is for women.
Yeah.
And I look at having my daughters and
when wildlife officials in Florida and Alabama started quietly releasing hundreds of snakes into the woods, a lot of people online had jokes ready. Florida already has a reputation for wild animal headlines, and the idea of government agencies deliberately turning loose more snakes sounded, to a lot of viewers, like a punchline waiting to happen. But the people making those jokes didn't know what they were looking at. These weren't invasive predators being dumped into the wild without a plan. They were eastern indigo snakes, one of North America's rarest native reptiles, and the animals being released were the product of a careful, decades-long science project designed to undo damage that people caused in the first place. What looks like a joke on the surface turns out to be one of the most patient and successful wildlife comeback stories happening in the American South right now, and almost nobody's heard the full version of it. To understand why this program exists, you have to go back to what the eastern indigo snake actually is. It's the longest native snake in the United States, capable of growing past 8 feet long, with smooth, glossy, blue-black scales that can look almost iridescent in the sunlight. Despite the size, it's completely non-venomous and, by most accounts from people who've handled them, remarkably calm and even curious around humans. The indigo doesn't kill by venom or constriction the way many people assume snakes do. It simply overpowers its prey with raw strength and swallows it whole, and its diet is part of what makes this species so important. Eastern indigo snakes eat rodents, birds, frogs, and other snakes, including venomous ones like rattlesnakes and cottonmouths. In places where indigo snakes still thrive, they act as a natural check on populations of animals most people would rather not run into. That's the snake-killing reputation that made headlines. This is one of the only wild animals in North America that regularly preys on venomous snakes as part of its normal diet. Part of what makes the eastern indigo snake so striking in person, according to biologists and handlers who've worked with them for years, is the contrast between its size and its temperament. This is an animal that can rival some pythons in length, yet it's regularly described as docile enough that trained researchers can handle wild-caught individuals for health checks and radio tag attachment without much of a struggle. It moves differently than a lot of people expect from a large snake too, often described as more active and alert during daylight hours, patrolling open, sandy pine forests rather than lying in ambush the way many other snake species do. That daytime activity pattern is actually one of the reasons researchers have been able to study it as closely as they have. Unlike a lot of secretive reptiles that are almost impossible to track, indigo snakes can be observed moving through their territory in daylight, which is part of why camera trap monitoring has worked so well for this particular reintroduction effort. For most of the 20th century, the eastern indigo snake ranged across Florida, southern Georgia, southern Alabama, and parts of Mississippi. Then, over the course of a few decades, it nearly vanished from huge parts of that range. The reasons weren't dramatic or mysterious. They were the same reasons so many species disappear: habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and the disappearance of a very specific neighbor the indigo snake depends on, the gopher tortoise. Indigo snakes rely heavily on the burrows gopher tortoises dig, using them as shelter from cold weather, from fire, and from predators. As longleaf pine forests were logged, converted to farmland, or broken up by development, gopher tortoise populations collapsed, and indigo snakes lost the shelter system they depended on for generations. Add to that decades of rattlesnake roundups, where wild snakes of all species were captured or gassed out of burrows, and unregulated collection for the pet trade, and by the 1970s the eastern indigo snake had disappeared entirely from large stretches of the Florida Panhandle and Alabama where it used to be common. In 1978, it became one of the first reptiles ever listed under the Endangered Species Act, and by the early 1980s, biologists confirmed indigo snakes had been completely wiped out from places like the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle. The last confirmed sighting there was in 1982. For roughly 40 years, this apex predator simply wasn't part of that ecosystem anymore, and everything underneath it in the food chain shifted because of it. The relationship between the indigo snake and the gopher tortoise deserves a closer look because it explains why this particular reintroduction effort had to become so much bigger than just breeding snakes in captivity. Gopher tortoises are what ecologists call a keystone species in their own right. They dig extensive underground burrows, sometimes stretching more than 10 feet deep and 40 feet long, that stay at a stable temperature and humidity no matter what's happening on the surface. Those burrows end up housing far more than just the tortoise that dug them. More than 350 other species have been documented using gopher tortoise burrows at some point, from indigo snakes and gopher frogs to burrowing owls and a wide range of insects. When a landscape loses its gopher tortoises, it doesn't just lose one species, it loses an entire underground shelter system that dozens of other animals were quietly relying on. Indigo snakes in particular depend on those burrows to escape freezing winter temperatures and wildfire, since they don't dig burrows of their own. So when logging, agriculture, and development fragmented Florida's longleaf pine forests through the middle of the 20th century, gopher tortoise numbers collapsed first, and the ripple effect through the ecosystem, including the eventual local extinction of the indigo snake, followed close behind. That's part of why any serious effort to bring indigo snakes back had to start with restoring tortoise habitat, not just breeding snakes. This is where the story most people missed actually begins. In the early 2000s, a coalition of conservation groups, universities, and state and federal wildlife agencies formed the Eastern Indigo Snake Reintroduction Committee, with a goal that sounds simple on paper and turned out to be enormously difficult in practice. Bring the species back to places it had been erased from, using captive breeding instead of waiting for wild populations to recover on their own, which they almost certainly wouldn't have. The centerpiece of that effort became a facility called the Orion Center for Indigo Conservation, established by the nonprofit Orion Society around 2011 and operated since 2014 by the Central Florida Zoo and Botanical Gardens in Sanford, Florida. It remains the only captive breeding facility in the world dedicated specifically to producing eastern indigo snakes for release back into the wild, not for zoos, not for collectors, but for the woods they came from. The breeding process itself is slower and more deliberate than most people would guess. Breeding season at the center runs from October through February. Females lay between 4 and 13 eggs, typically sometime between April and June, and those eggs incubate for roughly 100 days before hatching in the summer. That's just the beginning. The hatchlings then spend about a year at the center under close observation, cared for and monitored for health and development, before many of them are transferred to partner facilities. Zoo Atlanta, Zoo Tampa, and the Waialaka National Fish Hatchery near Jacksonville all take part in what conservationists call head starting, essentially raising the juvenile snakes for a second year until they are large enough and strong enough to have a real shot at surviving in the wild. Only after 2 full years of controlled growth are the snakes considered ready for release, and even then, researchers know that survival isn't guaranteed. This isn't a program built around big, dramatic numbers. It's built around patience, and around every single snake mattering. Before release, each snake typically gets fitted with some form of tracking, whether that's a small implanted transponder for identification or, for a subset of animals, radio telemetry equipment that lets biologists follow individual movements for months after release. That tracking data is what allows researchers to answer the questions that actually determine whether a reintroduction program is working. How far does a released snake travel in its first year? Does it find and use gopher tortoise burrows the way wild-born indigo snakes do? Does it survive the winter? Every one of those data points feeds back into decisions about which snakes to release, how many, and where, turning what looks from the outside like a simple release event into the visible endpoint of a constant feedback loop between the breeding center and the wild population. The actual release sites tell you a lot about how carefully this program was planned. There are 2 primary locations. One is the Conecuh National Forest in southern Alabama, where releases have been happening since 2010. Between 2010 and 2020, roughly 190 snakes were released there, a number that sounds modest until you understand that a single eastern indigo snake can range across more than 1,000 acres of territory. These aren't animals you release by the truckload into a random patch of woods. Each individual snake represents a meaningful presence across a huge stretch of habitat. The second major site is the Nature Conservancy's Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle, the same preserve where indigo snakes were declared locally extinct back in 1982. Releases there began in 2017, and this year marked the 10th consecutive year of releases at that preserve, with more than 200 snakes returned to that specific stretch of longleaf pine forest since the program started. In the most recent round of releases, conservation teams put out a combined total of 42 juvenile indigo snakes across the 2 sites in late April and early May, 21 in the Florida Panhandle and 21 in Alabama, continuing a rhythm that's been building for close to a decade and a half. Program leaders have been careful to frame each of these releases not as a one-time event, but as another data point in a long-running experiment. Every spring release adds to a growing picture of how the reintroduced population is adapting, surviving, and, biologists hope, eventually reproducing entirely on its own. The Apalachicola release marked in the most recent round wasn't just another batch of snakes. It was specifically noted as the 10th consecutive annual release at that preserve since the program began there in 2017, a milestone that reflects nearly a decade of uninterrupted, carefully sequenced work at a single site. That kind of consistency, showing up every single year regardless of funding pressures or changing political attention, is often what separates conservation programs that actually succeed from ones that fizzle out after an initial burst of enthusiasm. None of this happens in isolation from the rest of the ecosystem, and that's really the part that makes this story more interesting than a simple endangered animal gets released headline. Reintroducing indigo snakes only works if the habitat around them can actually support them, which means the reintroduction program is tied directly to a much bigger restoration effort involving fire management, longleaf pine forest recovery, and the protection of gopher tortoise populations. Florida alone has placed nearly 80,000 acres under permanent conservation easements connected to this effort and has restored more than 2 million acres of gopher tortoise habitat as of a few years ago. Land managers have used controlled, prescribed fire, the same kind of periodic burning that longleaf pine ecosystems evolved alongside for thousands of years, across more than 1.5 million acres in Florida alone between 2010 and 2020, deliberately recreating the natural fire cycles that keep these forests healthy and open enough for gopher tortoises, and by extension indigo snakes, to thrive. Georgia has run a parallel effort, protecting more than 90,000 acres of easements tied to over 60 separate gopher tortoise populations, alongside large-scale prescribed burns and the planting of roughly 1 million longleaf pine trees. In other words, you can't just drop snakes into the woods and hope for the best. Every release is the visible tip of a much larger, much slower restoration project working underneath it, rebuilding an entire ecosystem piece by piece so that one keystone predator has somewhere to actually live. The fire piece of that puzzle tends to surprise people who aren't familiar with how longleaf pine ecosystems actually work. For most of human history, the eastern United States longleaf pine forests weren't dense, shaded woodlands. They were open, sunlit, park-like landscapes maintained by frequent, low-intensity fires, some sparked by lightning and, for thousands of years before European colonization, many deliberately set by indigenous communities managing the land. Those regular fires kept hardwood shrubs and thick underbrush from taking over, allowing sunlight to reach the forest floor and supporting the open, grassy conditions that gopher tortoises and indigo snakes both need to move around and hunt effectively. When fire suppression became standard land management policy through much of the 20th century, longleaf pine forests across the southeast became overgrown and shaded in a way that made them far less hospitable to the species that had evolved alongside regular burning. Modern prescribed fire programs are essentially trying to recreate that original rhythm on purpose, on a controlled and monitored basis, which is why the 1.5 million acres of fire-managed land in Florida and the additional burning happening in Georgia and Alabama aren't just a side note to the indigo snake story. They are arguably the single most important piece of infrastructure making the whole reintroduction possible. There's also a citizen science angle to this that a lot of people don't know about, and it's a good example of how conservation work has changed in the age of the internet. Wildlife officials in Florida, working with the Central Florida Zoo's Orion Center and the Nature Conservancy, launched a project that uses trail and camera trap footage from the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve to track how the released snakes are doing. Volunteers anywhere in the world can log onto a platform called Zooniverse and help identify individual snakes from photographs, since each indigo snake has scale patterns distinctive enough to be recognized like a fingerprint. That data gets funneled back to biologists across the entire partner network, feeding directly into decisions about where future releases should happen and how the population is adapting over time. It's a small but telling detail about how modern reintroduction programs work. This isn't a single agency working in secret. It's a sprawling, multi-decade collaboration between state wildlife commissions, federal agencies, zoos, universities, private landowners, conservation nonprofits, and ordinary volunteers sitting at their computers, all pointed at the same goal. So why does any of this matter beyond one species of snake getting a second chance? Ecologists who study these longleaf pine ecosystems describe the eastern indigo snake as something close to a keystone predator for that habitat, meaning its presence or absence has effects that ripple outward through the entire food web. When indigo snakes disappeared from places like the Apalachicola Panhandle, populations of smaller predators and prey species shifted in ways that changed the balance of the whole ecosystem, the kind of slow, hard-to-notice change that doesn't make headlines but adds up over 40 years of absence. Bringing the indigo snake back isn't just a feel-good story about a pretty animal getting saved. It's an attempt to restore a functioning piece of machinery that the whole ecosystem was quietly missing. And because indigo snakes prey on venomous species like rattlesnakes and cottonmouths, their return can also have a very direct, practical benefit for the humans who share that landscape, potentially reducing encounters between people and the venomous snakes that indigo snakes naturally keep in check. There's a broader pattern here that shows up again and again in ecology, sometimes called a trophic cascade, where the loss or return of a single predator species changes the behavior and population size of the species below it, which in turn changes the vegetation and habitat structure of an entire landscape. It's the same basic dynamic that made wolves famous when they were reintroduced to Yellowstone decades ago, where their return changed elk grazing patterns enough to allow riverside vegetation to recover, which in turn changed the shape of rivers and the distribution of other wildlife. The eastern indigo snake situation is smaller in scale and far less publicized, but ecologists working on the project describe a similar underlying logic. A landscape with its full predator community intact behaves differently, and often more stably, than one missing a piece of it, even if that missing piece is a snake most people will never personally encounter. None of this has been easy, and it's worth being honest about the scale of the challenge instead of pretending this is a story with a neat, finished ending. Researchers openly describe these efforts as only the beginning of building a healthy, sustainable population. Survival rates for young, released snakes are still being studied. Long-term reproduction in the wild, meaning released snakes successfully breeding on their own and their offspring surviving to adulthood, is one of the key markers biologists are watching for as proof that a self-sustaining population is actually taking hold, rather than the population simply depending on captive breeding forever. Funding for the program comes from a patchwork of sources.